Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Way podcast, and today I'm joined by writer Olga Wojtas. Hello Olga.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming through from Edinburgh to talk to me.
I'm delighted, except I have to say when I came out of Buchanan bus station, it was torrential rain and I am completely soaked.
Well, I was thinking you've done more than I think your protagonist Shona would have done. I don't think she would have made the same trip.
I don't think so, no.
We'll come on to that maybe later on. So we're going to talk about the latest in the Miss Blaine's Prefect series of novels. It's Miss Blaine's Prefect and the Parcel of Rogues. But before we get to A Parcel of Rogues, can you explain the premise of the series of Miss Blaine's Prefect and who she is?
Sure. I'm reclaiming the importance of middle-aged women because Shona, my heroine, is 50-something because I'm tired of things where you have protagonists who are young and gorgeous. Shona Aurora McMonagle is a 50-something librarian in Morningside Library in Edinburgh. But she was educated at the Marcia Blaine School for Girls, where she got the finest education in the world. And some listeners may remember that the Marcia Blaine School for Girls was the school in Muriel Sparks' The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie.
Absolutely.
And she actually wrote that about her own school, which was James Gillespie's high school in Edinburgh. And that is the school I went to as well.
So have you always had a complicated relationship with the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, and perhaps Jean Brodie herself?
So very much so, because in fact, I was at school when the book came out.
Right.
And I was too wee to understand anything about it at that point, but the school was absolutely horrified. Because as you know, Muriel Spark wrote it about her own teacher, Miss Christina Kay. And, you know, there was no doubting that this was Christina Kay, who went to Italy every year for her holidays and called all of her pupils the creme de la creme. So it was obviously Miss Kay. And when the book came out, there were still teachers teaching at the school who had taught with Miss Kay. And the school considered that it had brought the school into disrepute. So basically, you know, they were horrified by the whole thing. Now I have to say the school cannot get enough of her. And there's a Muriel Spark building and there's a Brodie's Cafe.
Well, that's such an interesting switch, isn't it? And also, you know, many novels say any relation to someone living or dead is purely incidental, but in this case, it's clearly not.
Absolutely not. But what happens in this case is, as you know, there's a tension with Jean Brodie as the teacher in the school and the ethos of the school, which is, you know, all very competitive and collegiate and all the things that Jean Brodie despises. My heroine has absorbed all the, you know, the great tenets of the Marcia Blaine School, and she spends her time as a librarian hiding copies of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie so that people can't read them because she's shocked by it and thinks it has brought the school into disrepute.
So that's who she is. How does she have her adventures, so to speak? What way? It's quite an unusual. I mean, you could say these are science fiction.
You could, because she is indeed a time traveller.
Yeah.
This is not something that she planned to do, but basically Miss Marcia Blaine herself, turned up in the library one day. Shona isn't entirely sure how old she is, but figures she must be several hundred years old. And she turned up in the library, a woman in her prime, I have to say. She doesn't look several hundred years old. And she sent Shona on a time-travelling mission. The ethos of the Marcia Blaine School for Girls is to make the world a better place. And basically, Miss Blaine has worked out that if you're a time traveller, you can make other worlds a better place as well. So it basically spreads the goodness around. Shona has had the most magnificent education. She speaks all the languages. She knows every subject. Slight problem is that she is a total numpty. And she turns up in these places. She never has the faintest idea what's going on. She never knows what her mission is. But somehow things work out.
Yeah, I mean, Miss Blaine's a hard task mistress, isn't she? She
really,
indeed, you know, she throws her into these things.
Oh, she does, and she doesn't give her any help. She basically expects her to work things out. She is very tough. She effectively gives her a hint of what she's doing, but Shona generally misses the hint about what's going on.
Just as we're talking, it suddenly strikes me that it's not dissimilar to the premise of the TV show Quantum Leap. Did you ever see Quantum Leap?
I didn't, no.
No, it was in the 80s, maybe the 90s, and it's a guy who is sent backwards and forwards in time to basically fix something that had gone wrong. And, you know, like he would look in the mirror and he would be a teenage girl, or he would be a southern black man, or something like that. And then and he would have to work out, one, who he was supposed to be and what he was supposed to fix as well.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, it's good. I've tried to remake it fairly recently, but the original one was, it was kind of required viewing for teenagers in the 80s and in the 90s. So the new adventure is a Parcel of Rogues, and before we talk about it, could you give us a quick reading from it?
Yes, I'll give you a very short reading. Basically, Shona has turned up and has found herself in the assembly rooms in Edinburgh, and she's, as I say, her knowledge is unsurpassed, and she realises from the fact that there isn't a portico. And there are chandeliers, but they're just candle chandeliers. They're not the sort of diamond chandeliers we have now. So she's worked out that this must be before 1796. She's really spot on with dates. Anyway, she's also found that she's wearing a very décolleté dress, which she is quite upset about. She's quite prim and proper.
Yeah, she's a librarian in
Morningside. She's a librarian, exactly. Yes, quite. So she's not used to this. And she's found herself standing beside some Edinburgh ladies who are so absorbed in their conversation that, you know, they don't notice that she's there. So she's still trying to work out what's going on. And I shall just start this short reading. I was swept along like a leaf in a fast current as the ladies surged forward. I tried to slow down, to step back, but the momentum was too strong. I was being carried towards the raised platform at the far end of the room. Sharp elbows and impatient shoulders shoved into me as the ladies jockeyed for position. I didn't even notice the gap opening at first, but the crush of bodies funneled me forward. A moment previously, I had been anonymous and half hidden in the midst of the throng. Now, before I could catch my breath, I was disgorged right in front of the stage, with nothing but a pair of breeches in my eye line. I hastily looked upwards. A dark-haired man in his late 20s was standing on the stage, his upper half clad in a white linen shirt and neckcloth under a brown waistcoat and bottle green woolen overcoat. In the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, there's a portrait by Alexander Naismith. The man in the painting had suddenly come to life and was standing in front of me, the bard himself, Robert Burns. His male gaze was firmly fixed on my décolletage. Then he looked me straight in the eye and gave me a smile, followed by a long, slow wink. I was in absolutely no doubt as to what he meant. Get your cloak, you've pulled.
It's a wonderful bit. And it really is a great introduction because Shona arrives at the assembly and immediately, you know, she recognises not just Burns but others who are in the room. And it made me realise that this was a time where she arrives, where there were portraits of these people. People knew these things. You know, you could recognise some of the characters that were there. So I think Adam Smith's in the room.
That's right.
And Dougal Stewart and a lot of this is Enlightenment Edinburgh.
Exactly.
Slap bang in Enlightenment Edinburgh.
Yes.
Why did you want to write about this time and place?
Again, I've rehabilitated, I think, middle-aged women with Shona. And with this, I wanted to do some rehabilitation. This, in a way, has been a pretty unusual book for me because normally I have a particular setting, but I don't have real people in it. Or I may touch on people that in the second book. Debussy and Mary Garden are in it, but I mean, it's not sort of crucial. It's not fixed on them. There was one I did before, which was basically the true story of Macbeth.
Yeah,
because
right.
You know, we know that Shakespeare got it entirely wrong, but we've got the history, and what Shona likes to do is find out the true history, which is not like the history we've been passed down. And one of the main things I wanted to do was actually rehabilitate Walter Scott. Because we have got this idea of him as a very sort of serious, gloomy, solid character. And because he rewrote the magnum opus and put in all the waffle, we think of him as, very stodgy and so on. He was brilliant. He was so funny. He was a really, really good guy. And Coburn has a story, well, not a story, Coburn's describing Scott and says, if you were in Parliament Hall in Edinburgh and there were a lot of advocates in a group falling about laughing, it was because Scott was doing impersonations. Yeah. He was really good. So what I've got here is Scott as a teenager.
Yeah.
And I think that gives him the liveliness, but also it's because Scott, when he was 15, actually met Burns at a dinner party at Adam Ferguson's, and he was genuinely blown away by him. He came back and he just was a total fanboy, and he just wrote about how wonderful Burns was and how his eyes glowed and so on. So I just thought this is a really interesting relationship. And then I thought, we've got a view of Burns. We think of him as this fairly debauched character, drunken, chasing women. I thought, that's the story we've been given. That might not be true. Let's have a look at it.
Yeah, and the way you do that's lovely. Kind of commentary on publishing, I think, is perhaps the way you're doing it. Because he has this reputation which they want to encourage. The lad, if you like, in the modern parlance, the lad. And they whereas he really doesn't want to do that. He wants to go home.
Well, this was what I figured, because you think about the publishing industry now, and I have to say, I am not including my lovely publisher Saraband in this, but you hear about writers who are pressurised to do things, and also they're pressurised to go out on the circuit and go and meet readers. And writing is a very solitary activity.
Yeah.
Because you're a good writer doesn't necessarily mean you've got a personality that wants to go out and do readings and meet people and so on. So I just had this idea because, he was originally published, he had the Kilmarnock edition, but then William Creech in Edinburgh published this huge Edinburgh edition, 3,000 copies, which was massive.
Yeah.
And basically you think, Creech wants to make sure that his investment is going to pay off. So what do? We give Burns a personality. And obviously, if you say that somebody is racy, the women are going to be interested. The men are going to want to see how it's done. So he's going to get this huge public. But I like the idea that this is not him at all. He just wants to go back to Mauchline, to Jean Armour, and is having a terrible time in Edinburgh.
Yeah, he's a kind of presented as a rock star almost of the time.
Yes,
and the young Walter is sneaking out the house against his parents' knowledge to kind of go and see him. And it's absolutely relatable, I think, too. And that's the one other interesting thing. We get Scott's parents. We get to meet Scott's parents too.
Yes. And of course, Scott's father was genuinely, he was Walter Scott Sr. And he was a writer to the Signet. And Scott initially worked for him in his office as the writer to the Signet because, of course, Scott did become a lawyer. But from what I could gather, the Scotts had a good marriage. His parents had a good marriage, and his father did not put his mother down. No. But I wanted to bring that out. I have to say, you can read the whole thing as a very feminist tract. And in it, Scott's mother, who starts off being, despite the fact her husband is not being difficult, she sees herself as a sort of, very good wife and just looking after him and so on. And by the end, her personality has changed and she's come into her own. So there's a lot in it about the importance of the women who always in history end up taking a back seat. And I thought, no, let's have them to the fore.
And there is a solidarity between women, and we'll talk more about that later, which, when you find a group of like-minded people, it kind of gives you the strength, I think, to go on. But going back to Walter Scott, I completely agree with you. And anyone who ever goes to Abbotsford, which was his home, and looks around it, this is not the house of a boring man.
Absolutely not.
It's incredible.
No. And he kept picking things up, and he was obviously fascinated by all sorts of things.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I studied Scott at university, and it was almost presented with an apology. With some people like that, it's like, oh, well, you're going to read Waverley. It could do with a good edit or something like that. And he gets really deep into these. They're fantastic books.
They really are. I mean, they are rattling good yarns.
They really are, yeah.
And also, you've got the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels, which came out, 20 20 years ago, something like that, which actually went back to the originals and took out a lot of the waffle and put them in at the end. And they're gripping, and they're also, he has bits in them that are really funny.
Yeah.
And something that he does brilliantly is writing vernacular Scots.
Yeah.
And that, I think, has been really crucial because we've got... you can see the grammar of it, and you can see words that have maybe gone out of fashion. And I think he's done a huge service. I remember it was James Hogg's mother was very, very upset when Scott started collecting the Border Ballads, because she was saying, you're killing them. You know, these are things, these are an oral tradition. Yeah. You should not be writing them down. But the fact that he's written things down, as I say, he's given us this legacy that otherwise could well have been lost.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if his reputation has been damaged by the perception that he kind of invented North Britain, if you like, or, you know, inviting the king and tartanising and all those things, which I think is incredibly unfair as well.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people have a go at Scott that would never have read a word of his books.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And also, I mean, I think there's some truth in it that effectively he created the Scottish tourist industry because you got people from mainland Europe coming over to see these things. But I think the fact that, you know, he's seen as right-wing and conservative and pro-unionist, you know, is these things that, you know, to a lot of people are red flags. But they're not looking at the person. No. They're not looking at the personality and what he was like.
And he was also very pro-Scotland and Scots language and Scots tradition.
And Scots law.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Absolutely. All of those things, yeah. Well, and let's go back to the character of Burns. I just think about him when Shona talks to him in the coffee shop, and even for her to be in the coffee shop causes a stir.
Yes, because women at this stage did not go to coffee shops. Again, this is a book that I think is probably much more grounded in reality than I've ever written before. I've tended to riff on things in previous books, but with this is absolutely right, that women did not go into coffee shops. They were a male preserve. And Shona just swans in and everybody's absolutely horrified, these guys. So, I mean, again, this is Shona reclaiming the right for women to go into coffee shops. But Burns is, she's tracked Burns down because, you know, because in this persona as a lad, he's been staring down at her bosom.
And she believes that he is the character that we think he may.
Yes, and she's basically coming to tell him this is unacceptable. You cannot behave like this. You kind of hinted at this when you were talking about the books as a whole, but debunking myths, I think, is something that you enjoy doing. You know, looking at the perception, the perceived wisdom, and saying, well, there's got to be more to this story. And certainly, I mean, the business about the women, I think there probably is a degree of truth about that. Because the women, as I say, did not go to the coffee shops, but the women had salons that all these great men of the Enlightenment went to. They would hold open house, and one of the key figures in the book is Alison Coburn, who wrote one of the versions of The Floors of the Forest. And she kept open house, and all these great men would come, and they took an absolute loan of her because they came and they ate. And I think there's a story about, I can't remember whether it's David Hume or Adam Smith, but turning up at something like 10 o'clock at night and more or less expecting to be cooked scrambled eggs, which she went off and did. You know, so, you know, the women were sort of nurturing all these great men and were hosting these discussions. And I was thinking, well, they couldn't just have been shrinking violets in the background and the men were all talking and the women knew nothing about this. Thinking the women must have played a part. So I've got Shona seeing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, I think if David Hume or Adam Smith turned up at mine at 3 a.m, I might cook them scrambled eggs as well. Because you were talking about Burns as a rock star, but the novel and the time, the Enlightenment, was populated by huge figures.
Oh, exactly, because this was the hotbed of genius. Yeah. This was the thing when we were leading Europe.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's incredible to look back and think all these people were making all these breakthrough discoveries. They were transforming our understanding of the world and how things worked. It was incredible. It's
one of the things about reading the book is to think not just what was happening in Edinburgh, but how that where Scotland's position was at the time.
Yes.
Because it's fed into other places as well.
Absolutely.
This Enlightenment movement.
We were so important, and I hope these days may return.
Yes, absolutely. So, but what did you want to say about the Scottish Enlightenment in that time? Was it just that it is hugely male-dominated, of course, and I was going to describe them as a secret society of women, but you suggest it's maybe not so secret. What would you say? There's a group of women who meet. Shona becomes a kind of part of them.
And again, I think in the book I've really only got 2 people who are made up.
Right,
The others are real people. And these women, including the Duchess of Gordon, who was the person who effectively started the Gordon Highlanders, and she was absolutely drop dead gorgeous, and she recruited soldiers by having the king's shilling in her mouth and snogging them and passing on the king's shilling. And of course they were all queuing up, sort of get to snog the Duchess of Gordon. But I mean,
what a story.
These were really bright women, and they knew one another.
Yeah.
They met together. And again, when you've got, people who are intellectuals feeding off one another, I think that is very, very powerful. And as I say, I cannot imagine that the women were doing nothing except cooking scrambled eggs.
Yeah, well, exactly. And this idea that if you admire anyone, then you start to take on their ideas and think about the ideas that they are proffering, that they're putting out there.
And I think this was the great thing, that people were sharing ideas. And one person who I've got great affection for, who again is real and I've got in the book, is Lord Monboddo. And he is presented as absolutely nuts.
Yes, absolutely.
But I mean, he actually, when you think about it, he had quite a bright idea. He believed that we were all born with tails.
Yes.
And he believed that there was a conspiracy between mothers and midwives, that the midwives docked the tails at birth. But we can think about it as pre-Darwinism. He actually, it was quite a sensible idea. And he was a very, very bright man.
Yeah.
But I mean, the way he's seen now is just that he's
and as you kind of portray it in the book, people kind of see him as
barking mad. Yes,
as well.
Yes.
So one of my questions was how much of this is fiction. But you're suggesting nearly all of it is research. Your research must have been great. You must have enjoyed doing it.
Oh, enjoyed it very much indeed. I mean, this was a period I sort of knew bits about anyway, so was interested in. And one of the people I was also very interested in was our hanging judge, Lord Braxfield. And he's the character that Stevenson writes about in Weir of Hermiston.
Right.
Tragically unfinished. But in that it's fascinating because, I mean, Braxfield was an intelligent, well-educated man, but he insisted in speaking in very, very thick Scots. And you've got that in Weir of Hermiston. It's beautifully written by Stevenson because you've got this guy talking in really rough language, and at one point he's told that his wife of many years has just died, and he goes, "Aye, poor bitch," and that's it. That's him mourning his wife. But he has conversations with his son, and his son is obviously posh Edinburgh and is speaking effectively standard English, and you've got this dichotomy. So I wanted to have Braxfield in as the hanging judge, and I've got him, speaking in Scots. The other thing, which people may think that there's been some mistake in typesetting, but I absolutely refuse to have the apologetic apostrophe.
Right.
And the apologetic apostrophe is when you get Scots words which are given an apostrophe to show that they're a mistake for English. So if you say "o" instead of, you put an apostrophe in to show that you're missing the F.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, no, you're not saying "of" with a missing F, you're saying "o." So I have no apologetic apostrophes, and he speaks Scots like that, but he's speaking, very vernacular Scots.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I've heard that debate quite a lot recently. I think Len Penny was talking about it, about in poetry, and it's an interesting area because I think more and more as we discuss Scots more generally, this is not just a language today that's trying to be brought in. This is historic, going way,
Absolutely.
right back to the very
Well, one of
beginning.
my tutors at Aberdeen was Derek McClure, who's wonderful, and he, there's always the debate, is Scots a dialect or a language? And there was a wonderful line, which is, a language is a dialect that has an army and a navy. So basically, if you have that status as a country, you've got a language, but if you don't have that, you're just a dialect. But he refused to talk about Scots as a subset of English.
Yeah.
He said that Scots and English were two subsets of Anglic.
Yeah.
And they were two divergent languages. And I think that's a really good way of looking at it.
That is a really good way of looking at it, yeah. So going back to the research, where did you go for your research? Because it's there's so much written about Enlightenment Edinburgh and the people.
Yes.
Did you go to fiction, for instance?
I did both fact and fiction, but a lot of it was I went to Scots Heart of Midlothian.
Yes.
Because there's a lot about the courts. I have to admit my husband is a lawyer, so I had an interest in it from that point of view. But there was Heart of Midlothian for that. There was Weir of Hermiston. Also, there were books about Scots. There was the Catherine Carswell.
Yes, yeah.
Also, Catherine Cherkavska, who's written The Jewel, which is basically talking about his huge love for Jean Armour, and that carried him through all the time. But I was also reading. I also read Willie Roughhead, who does the notable British trials, who had the Deacon Brodie trial. And that was very helpful from the point of view of the Scottish legal system and how things went on. So, yes, it was a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. But I didn't do any primary research in the sense of going to something like the National Library of Scotland.
Yeah.
I was reading existing published books.
Yeah. Catherine's novel, I'd forgotten about that. It's a fantastic book. Catherine Cherkavska's The Jewel. It's really good. And there's a couple of things I thought it might be nice for listeners to know a bit more about. One is Sylvander and Clorinda, because some people do not know this story.
Right, yes.
So these were letters.
These were letters. It was basically, there was a lady in Edinburgh, Agnes McElhose, known as Nancy. She was estranged from her husband. Her husband was appalling. I mean, she was an abused wife. And he had gone off, I think, at this stage. I think he'd gone to Jamaica. There was a dreadful incident where she decided she wanted to try and reconcile with him. And she, as I say, I think it's Jamaica, but she'd gone to Jamaica to find that he had another wife. And she basically just got on the next boat back. But she had met Burns. And again, it's difficult to know. I've written it in a different way, but it does look as if they had fallen for one another, or they found one another very attractive. She was a very intelligent, well-educated woman. I know people argue about this. I'm pretty sure that nothing happened between them, because it would have been, she was a genteel member of Edinburgh society, despite the fact that she came from Glasgow. But had she got pregnant, that would have been, social ruin. Yeah. I have to say that Burns managed to get her maidservant pregnant. So, but they had this very intense correspondence, and they called each other Clorinda and Sylvander because these were sort of pastoral names. Yeah. But they were basically very beautifully written love letters with a degree of formality. And there is this cadre of letters now that we have between them. And what had actually happened, again, this is true in the book, Burns had an accident coming out of a coach. It's not clear whether he was pissed as a newt and fell out, or whether it was an accident that basically it was the fault of the coachman. But he had fallen and been pretty badly injured. There had been talk of actually amputating his leg.
Oh, right, okay.
And he ended up laid up for a month, and he had been about to meet Mrs. McElhose, and instead couldn't meet her, so had written. And then they started this correspondence. And they were writing maybe 3 times a day to one another. These, these very sort of lyrical letters, very formal letters, And there is now there's a tea room at the bottom of the high street near Holyrood called Clorinda's, which you can go to.
There is, that's right. I've passed by that. I know there's only a little bit about this story, but it does strike me that maybe they actually loved the writing of the letters rather than anything else, and
yes.
Anything beyond that actually was beside the point.
Yes, I think that's very likely the case, and obviously, with something like that, when they were writing these very beautiful letters, there's something quite exciting about that, to be doing that, because these are not just hi, how are you, I'm doing well. They're very beautifully structured. So they've put a lot of thought into the letter, and I think they were having great fun sending these letters backwards and forwards.
But if you read anything by Burns, you think this is someone who just loves the word, the written word, whatever it may be, and that comes to... That brings me to the Dunedin Whisperer. Is that a real thing as well?
It's not.
Right,
I did make that up. There was a newspaper, the Caledonian Mercury.
Right.
But I have made up this paper called the Dunedin Whisperer, which is basically a gossip sheet. And it's a paper that, everybody pretends not to read, but they do actually read. And if there's a juicy bit of gossip, it gets, talked about all around Edinburgh. But that was entirely made up.
Yeah, like Heat magazine in the noughties.
Exactly, yes.
And another thing which is interesting, and I don't know how much research I had to do with this, but it's the geography of Edinburgh itself.
Yes.
Because when Shona says she's from Morningside, it's like she's in the sticks.
That's right. It's extraordinary because, the geography has changed dramatically, and also the fact that we've actually got streets. You realise that in the days before pavements, when there were cobbles and so on, it was actually a real trek to go somewhere. And there was also slight problem in Edinburgh that you still had the Gardaí Lou situation of people emptying chamber pots out of windows. But yes, I did do quite a bit of research for that. And the main thing is they didn't have the Mound and George IV Bridge, which you suddenly realise are absolutely crucial to how we move now.
Absolutely.
Because Scott, lived in George Square. And this event has taken place in the assembly rooms. And he, as you say, has snuck out of his house and come to the assembly rooms. Now, that's something that would take you, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes. But that route did not exist.
Yeah.
And you were having to go uphill and down dale and round the side, and there weren't proper roads. And all that bit round the Cowgate and coming up to the Royal Mile, it was absolutely treacherous to navigate. It was very, very complicated. And as I say, you've got this major thoroughfare. It's like taking the Kingston Bridge away from Glasgow. You're thinking, well, how to get from A to B now?
Yeah.
So that was really pretty difficult to work that out.
And in terms of the Enlightenment itself, did writing the book change your views on any of that period?
Not really. It was, I just think it was such a remarkable period in history. I suppose the only thing that changed my views, which is probably something I hadn't really thought about, was the importance of the women. Because, you never hear about the women in any of the documentation. All you hear about them is as these hostesses, that people are coming round. And I'm thinking, well, this is preposterous. These were intelligent women. I'm sure they weren't just sitting there handing round the tea and biscuits.
Yeah. And I think I wanted to say about the Dunedin Whisperer is going back again to maybe a commentary on the publishing industry, but stories are leaked and things are...
Exactly, yes, because this is the idea that you can use these things to your own advantage. You make sure when the news gets out and so on, and who knows what. Yes, and that's been, for most of my life, I've been a journalist, so that was having a wee go at that.
Yes, a kind of PR campaign before, PR was... Did make me think how much of Burns' life at the time, but particularly following on, has been a kind of PR campaign to kind of...
There is that. You see it because we've got all this, and with Scott, you've got the shortbread tins and Bonnie Prince Charlie. You get these people who, there's a sort of iconic image, and a lot of the time we don't see beyond that. We've got a sort of vague idea about the person, but it may have very little bearing on reality.
Yeah.
But if I could backtrack slightly, you had also mentioned Morningside.
Yes.
And with that, I mean, it's quite extraordinary because, again, Morningside is, I don't know, half an hour's walk from the city centre. But at that point, it was out with the city. You still had the city boundaries. You had the ports, where people were walking beyond the city walls. And then when you came to the south side, you had the Borough Muir.
Yeah.
And that was a no-go area
Right.
because there wasn't anything there. It was basically, it was open land. It wasn't particularly safe. You would have footpaths there. There was obviously no street lighting.
Yeah.
So you had this area that people didn't go to. And then beyond that, you had this wee village of Morningside, and never the twain shall meet.
Yeah.
And Shona, of course, sees herself as a very good Edinburgh person coming from Morningside, and everybody's going, oh, Morningside? Oh, that's a terrible long
don't want to
distance
go.
away. And also, they just look on it as, you know, there's just sort of a few fields and cabbages. And in fact, at that stage, I think there were only 100 people
Yeah.
staying in Morningside. So, you know, they just look on it as going to the moon to go to Morningside.
It's so interesting how your kind of modern look on these things, because I've made that walk from Morningside into Edinburgh, and on a nice day it's a perfectly pleasant, you know,
Absolutely,
and the way
yes.
that they kind of consider it, I suppose it would have been the same in a lot of places, but yeah, it's not just where it is, but it's how you get there. Going back to
Yes.
bridges not being there,
Yes.
roads not being there, and all of those things.
Exactly. And also there's the idea that these people are effectively peasants.
Yeah.
You know, the
Yeah,
people in Edinburgh, they know about things, they're intellectual, but, you know, once you get beyond the city boundary, you're clueless and you don't know about anything.
And that divide must have been so pronounced at this time in particular, where you have thinkers whose work would influence go around globally, and then but what do these farmers or whoever it might be outside of that know?
Exactly. And that, I think, is what makes Burns's contribution
Yeah.
all the more remarkable.
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously, he hated being a ploughman, which I haven't actually mentioned, but, you know, you've got this person who, to the people of the Edinburgh Enlightenment, completely untutored and so on, and coming from, you know, a country area and so on. And yet he's so brilliant that he gets feted. And his genius at writing in both English and Scots, it's unsurpassed.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
And you mentioned James Hogg as well earlier, Ettrick Shepherd. So that
Yes.
that kind of
Yes.
hardworking, but also touched with this genius. It shows you how the perception of writers and class, I guess, was changing. Maybe
Yes.
maybe not forever, but it was at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah, because
yes.
I've seen various depictions of Burns at that period in Edinburgh where he is being kind of, I mean, you could say patronised, but certainly wined and dined and brought into company and always told to perform for us, give us a poem.
I think to an extent there's surprise about how well he behaves.
Yeah.
You know, you do get sort of, you know, the odd comment that obviously they think he won't know how to use his soup spoon.
He's from the West Coast, for goodness sake.
Absolutely, he is quite. So there is a bit of that, but they are obviously, you know, there is absolute recognition of his genius.
Yeah. And going back to the beginning, Miss Blaine, we get to learn more about Miss Blaine
do,
too.
yes.
I don't know how much you want to say about that, but certainly as the novel progresses, things come to light which kind of feed into the whole series.
Well, this, we actually discover Miss Blaine before she has founded the school. And Shona quite often gets agitated about changing history.
Yeah.
She's quite upset because when she was in Venice in the 1600s and she introduced a Gilbert and Sullivan song to them, she worries that she's done something terrible. And here she's always worried that she's going to do something like changing what will happen. But here the important thing is Miss Blaine going to found the school?
Yeah,
Because she hasn't founded the school, and Shona realises that this is going to be quite a crucial issue.
Do you have a favourite novel in the series? I ask because I think this is mine.
Well, I have to say, I think this is mine as well, but it really is quite different because, as I say, with all the others, I have a lot of characters who are even unnamed. In
Yeah.
you know, in the first one, I had the princess, I had the countess. You know, you never found out what these people's names were.
Yeah.
They were, which makes them almost like ciphers, except they weren't. And you know, I sort of riff on bits of history. In the second one, I like doing things, bringing in things that are completely mad and that I've just made up, and then something that's true that isn't made up. And, you know, the readers hopefully will not know which is which. And a fact that I brought in the second one that I just loved, and I'm sure people will think I've made up, is that Toulouse-Lautrec was he loved cooking.
Yeah.
He was really fond of cooking and inventing things, and he invented chocolate mousse. And when he invented it, he called it chocolate mayonnaise. And because he was making it as he would make mayonnaise.
Eggs
He was
and
making
yeah.
chocolate mousse. And I've got Shona saying, tell him not to call it chocolate mayonnaise, tell him to call it chocolate mousse. So I've got things like that I bring in. But with this, there's a huge amount of it that is absolutely genuine and, you know, is factually correct. And the court scenes are by and large factually correct. And, you know, I think a lot of people will just think I've made a lot of it up when I haven't.
Well, the thing I like about it is because I've studied the writers, the Scottish writers, but also the Scottish philosophers as well at the time. And what you've done is really bring them all to life, give them these personalities that you wouldn't get. Some of them, I mean, Hume's personality, I think, comes across in his work, but, you know, you wouldn't maybe get from reading them or knowing about their lives, which is a lovely thing to do, I think. It really kind of brings the whole period and gives it a different spin, a very humorous spin as well, as all your books do.
Well, I have enjoyed writing this one, so I do hope that people are going to enjoy reading it.
And Miss Blaine, Shona, are there further adventures to come?
There may be. My publisher is really lovely and very, very tolerant, so I've had another idea, so we'll see whether that gets taken forward.
And are you working on anything else at the moment? Are you?
Yes, I have a secret life. I write a series under an assumed name. This is a series of cosy crime novellas which are only available online, and they're set in the Cotswolds. It's basically sort of like Midsummer Murders. And the publishers were about to publish the first one when they realised that I had a weird foreign name. And they said, no, this was no good because the things I'm writing are quintessentially English. You know, they're set in the Cotswolds.
Yeah.
They're, you know, very English.
So we can't have an Olga.
Exactly. No, that just doesn't work at all. So my middle name is Helena, and I grew up in Edinburgh and Marchmont Road. So I'm now Helena Marchmont, who I think sounds very posh. So I have just finished number 21 of the novellas.
Wow. Yeah. And they're just available online.
I'm afraid they are. They're just online, yes. But they are. There's also an audio version for people who enjoy audiobooks.
Yeah.
And it is narrated by Nathaniel Parker, the guy who was Inspector Linley in the Inspector Linley mysteries. And he is superb. And he said he actually lived near the Cotswolds for quite a long time, and he can do the local accents, and he can also do, you know, he can do men, women, different ages. He's a proper actor. He can really do it. So he really brings the books to life. He reads them superbly well.
I'll have to check out Helena Marchmont, definitely, particularly the audiobooks. And, you know, you and I often bump into each other at Edinburgh book festivals and other bookish places, and they're just starting to release what's happening this year. Is there anything you're particularly looking forward to? Well,
unfortunately, we haven't yet got the programme. Now, this is something, if I can have a pet gripe.
Yes, you can.
We get the festival brochure that comes out, but the book festival brochure comes out ages afterwards. And I book things for the festival and then find there are book festival things I can't go to because I've booked for something else.
Of course.
I want them both out at the same time.
Yeah.
So, as I say, I think it's the 16th of June, I think, that the book festival programme comes out.
I'm sure they've started to put out a few names.
This
kind of headliners.
This is the headliners that I think will probably be in the McEwan Hall rather than the Futures Institute.
Yeah.
But we haven't got the full programme. But I mean, you know, I just love the book festival.
Yeah.
And I was so upset when it left Charlotte Square because Charlotte Square was iconic. But I think this really is a very, very good replacement because you've got sort of gardens, you've got lawns beside it, and the main venues are lovely. So I really look forward to the book festival. I think it's so good.
Me too. It's my favourite kind of part of festival season, if you like. And also my worry was when they moved from Charlotte Square, I always looked at Putnam as an oasis in the madness that was going on elsewhere.
Exactly.
But they've kept that feel they are, you know.
Yes, because it is sort of off the main drag. It's a sort of area sort of in its own grounds, and you feel you're in there just surrounded by books. It's wonderful.
I can't wait. It's always wonderful. Olga, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me. I really do appreciate it. And as I say, this is my favourite Miss Blaine so far. But I look forward to what comes next.
That's so kind of you. Thank you very much.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.